show you again slower in between the next two meetings. Because then the lights will automatically always shut off, and then you control them right here. This is your lights control right here. And then you would just turn them back on because they shut off automatically.
Yeah, so it's going to be the first real item.
Looks like I've been in a lot of bar fights. There's a correction.
Why didn't that go up?
It started to and then came back down.
So we have slightly staff level Yeah, when it starts getting in the lunchtime, there's an interest in it.
Blood sugar goes down.
Yes. Yes.
Huh?
Member Fig,
Here.
Member Sharkey, Member Nast, Vice Chair Schnapp,
Here.
Chair Spiegel,
Oh, sorry about that. And to, on next in on the is, next on the row is to the agenda. Is there anybody who wants to pull something from the agenda?
No, I move to approve.
I'll second.
And our third is a presentation from, Director Bob Nass, but I believe. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You have to.
So, yeah, so.
Okay. All those in favor of the agenda the way it is?
Aye.
Opposed? No. But I'd like to introduce Akbar, who is going to give us some background and introduce Bob Nass to us.
Just to give you kind of some short background before I introduce Bob up here and we get the presentation queued. This item was a request that Director Nass had made to our district board some time ago, and that was to perform baseline testing of United groundwater wells. However, with multiple attempts, we've kind of hit a roadblock, and here we are today, and Bob's going to go through all the detail on why it might be important to test our groundwater at the PHWA level. So at the end of that presentation, there's no official action that's recommended today. However, what I hope would come of this is that after Bob's making his case, is that we as PHWA allow for that testing to happen. And as a side note, the district has already committed funds to perform the testing, so even better yet, to our Port Hueneme friends, this would come out of the Beach District budget, and it would be at no cost to the PHWA members. So with no more delay, we'll introduce Bob and get the presentation underway.
Thank you, Akbar, and also thank you for helping me reduce this presentation. It's now only 14 slides. It was much more than that, and it almost looked like death by PowerPoint the way I had it, so thank you. And also, I want to thank you for agendizing this particular topic. It's one that I hold very close, and after you hear it, I don't think we're going to have a hard time making the case for baseline water testing. Just waiting now for the first PowerPoint. But listen, while you're waiting for that, in order to make the case for baseline water testing, you'll need to know about the real threats to our underground sources of drinking water posed by conventional and unconventional oil drilling, agrotoxins, and industrial waste. Now, I'm not sure if everybody understands the difference between conventional and unconventional oil drilling or oil exploration and production, but simply put, the conventional oil production is your father's oil production. And anybody that's a student of history would know that we should have been running out of oil. It's called peak oil before this. Sweet, crude, easily accessed is very difficult to find anymore. The last fields were in Iraq, and I'm not sure how long that's going to last. So what happened almost 30 years ago was that they decided that there was a lot of unconventional oil reservoirs and natural gas contained in shale rock. And they have the shale fields in Pennsylvania called the Marcellus well fields, and we have ours in Monterey, but we also have them here too on the Oxnard Plain. So the unconventional oil drilling can be broken out simply for us and for the purposes of this discussion is it will be fracking, acidizing, and steam lift. So what is fracking? Well, I've just described to you the reason why we need it is because we're running out of oil. This slide depicts, and excuse me, we practiced this, believe it or not, before. Okay, just to give you a little bit of history about, it was about a year ago that I was elected to the board, and I feel it was because I had promised that we would be conducting baseline water testing. And that obviously resonated with our 1,900 constituents, and I did pretty well in the elections. So I've been trying since then to make sure that I'm able to fulfill a campaign promise. And with your help, I hope we can do that. Okay, making the case for baseline water testing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What's hydrofracturing? Hydraulic fracturing, also called hydrofracturing, and the short term is fracking. If anybody has a problem with that terminology, I can call it something else. One of the things that comes to mind is an monument to man's greed and stupidity. But anyway, what's hydraulic fracturing? This depicts a side view of what straight line fracking looks like. Normally, the operators use this type of fracking in Ventura County due to the unique fractured geology. Horizontal drilling, where the bore would be going down and then off to the side, that's used more in the Bakersfield area where they have more of a flat shale beds. Because of the mountains here in the Oxnard Plain, we have upwellings and more of a fractured geology, and this is how you get more oil, by using the straight fraction. Looking at this particular side view, the first thing that strikes you is that if anything were to happen to the well integrity, the aquifer is shot. And once you get oil into an aquifer, it's almost game over. You see the hydraulic fracturing zones there. Fracking practices, as I said, hydraulic fracturing is taking water, a lot of water, mixing it with some benign chemicals and some very toxic and carcinogenic ones, and then forcing it into the ground under high pressure to create fractures in the rock, in the shale that contains the oil. And then there's also mixed in sand and a propellant to keep those fractures open so the oil can flow up the wellbore. We also, in California, we have, because of our geology, acidizing, and it's used usually with fracking, or it can be used by itself. Hydrofluoric acid is used most. We also have large deposits of bitumen, or tar sands. Everybody's familiar with the Canadian tar sands? Well, we have them here in Oxnard. And it's a very energy-intensive operation. We heat up those particular tar sands using steam injection that's fired by natural gas, and then the tar sand reservoir can be accessed. Oxnard Field contains large quantities of tar sand, by the way. This particular view graph serves two purposes. One, it looks at the life cycle of hydraulic fracturing, but more importantly for our purposes, it also indicates where hydraulic fracturing can contaminate and threaten our underground sources of drinking water. The first way is during the acquisition phase. Now, besides threatening the quality of underground water, fracking also uses scarce California water resources. Fracking can use between 2 to 8 million gallons of fresh water And the reason for that disparity between 2 and 8 million, back in Pennsylvania, the well bores are deeper. Therefore, you need more water. In California, there's more shallow fracking going on, and that's around the 2 million mark per frac, and you can have multiple frac jobs. That's the good news for California. The bad news for California is that the deeper wells make it harder for those toxins to migrate up to the aquifer. The second is actually chemical mixing, and we're talking about some very benign chemicals that you wouldn't even think. But we also have some that we really need to look at. And if many of the fraction chemicals are considered proprietary, that means that we're not going to know what they are. If you don't know what you're looking for, you're never going to find it. Testing has been updated to reflect testing hasn't been updated to reflect fracking. I'll read that again. Testing hasn't been updated to reflect fracking. Testing is regulated by the Safe Water Drinking Act. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 exempted fracking from the Safe Water Drinking Act. The third way that we can contaminate underground sources is by the actual well and the injection itself. Problems with physical integrity of fracked wells are rife. Usually bad cement jobs are to blame. If you recall, the BP oil spill in the Gulf was the result of a bad Halliburton cement job. It's estimated that 6% of Pennsylvania frack wells leak or will leak. Note, the horizontal drilling to which I alluded to earlier is depicted here on this slide. It's better suited for the Monterey Shale and the Bakersfield area. Wastewater is, and the fourth way that we can contaminate underground sources is by temporary and also permanent storage and handling, improper handling above ground near the aquifer. Wastewater is stored in lined and unlined pits called sumps. Later on you'll see where the sumps are on the Oxnard Plain. Leaking sumps have caused underground sources of drinking water to be contaminated in Ventura County. It's mainly in the upper Ojai area. The fifth way is through wastewater treatment and waste disposal. Most of Ventura County wastewater is disposed of by injecting it into two deep injection wells owned by Antera and located at Rose and Woolley Avenues in Oxnard. Now, one of the things about these deep injection wells is it's a recipe for disaster because overuse of these deep injection wells can trigger earthquakes. It has it in Oklahoma. And the last thing you want is earthquakes disturbing the physical integrity of active and inactive and abandoned oil wells here in the Oxnard oil patch. This slide just merely shows where all the various plays are in the United States as of 2011. The Energy Information Administration, the EIA, indicated a growing shales plays. The good news, because of fracking, the U.S. has gone from an oil and gas importer to an exporter. The bad news, we'll probably be running out of oil before we run out, we'll probably be running out of water, before we run out of oil. It's not a good thing for the planet or California. I don't know if you can read this or not, but if you're looking at the yellow dots, this slide needs to be updated for one thing because the fracking boom in California didn't really take off until 2008. The location of the oil wells in relation, I ask you to note the location of the oil wells in relationship to United Waters Conservation District water wells in El Rio and the upper and lower aquifer systems should also be considered. to make this an ideal view graph, we would want to be able to kind of superimpose where the Oxnard upper and lower aquifer systems are. But the main thing is that you do not want to be drawing water that is down gradient from a well. Okay, on this particular view graph, it shows the oil well sumps, and we have approximately 410 oil sumps. I invite your attention to the number of active oil wastewater sumps in the Satakoy area, which are up gradient to United Waters Conservation District El Rio well farm. Also, El Rio lies in an area of abandoned oil wells shown in pink. Are you able to locate the El Rio area there on your maps? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that United is exhaustively testing in accordance with the current regulations, and I emphasize that because fracking is not regulated, essentially, because of this Energy Policy Act of 2005, also known as the Halliburton loophole. The water, don't get us wrong, the water has been successfully, it has consistently proven to be safe. And we don't expect to find any problems, nor are we looking for any particular problems. But if contamination should, and that's in quotes, occur sometime in the future from oil, industrial, and agricultural sources, it's practically impossible to prove the source of that pollution. Defendants can't argue that public water was already contaminated before drilling began. The solution is baseline water testing. So the baseline testing 101, succinctly, it documents the water quality under current conditions. And why is it necessary? Well, conventional and unconventional oil extractions, fracking, acidizing, steam lift, industrial activities, and large-scale agricultural activities pose real threats to the integrity of underground sources of Ventura County drinking water. What to do is a pre-drilling baseline test is a form of a one-time low-cost insurance policy in case contamination should occur in the future. It's like a passive countermeasure system, if you will. The baseline test screens for signature chemicals that are typically associated with oil well activity, including waste fluids and those toxins, and maintains a strict chain of custody because it has to go to court. So what usually happens when you don't use baseline water testing? You don't win in court. I'll let you read this. It's rather lengthy.
Are we through?
Are there any questions? Okay, a recent example, a $4.24 million verdict in Pennsylvania was tossed. U.S. Magistrate John Martin Carlson on Friday set aside the verdict reached a year ago by a jury in Scranton, saying the evidence presented by the Dimmick homeowners was spare, sometimes contradictory, frequently rebutted by other scientific expert testimony, and relied in some measure upon tenuous inferences. I think these folks would have been better off sticking with the crowd. It looks like dozens of plaintiffs settled with Cabot in 2012, but 2 families opted to take their case to trial. There have been problems with their wastewater before the company started drilling, and it was hard to argue that Cabot was the sole cause of any problems. Okay, one of the reasons why we don't hear so much about the water being contaminated by fracking is that over 90% of all cases are settled out of court. The litigants take the money and they sign non-disclosure agreements, in effect gag orders. The oil companies have been getting by with it. So how did I learn about baseline water testing? Well, somebody was asking about, oh, you're the fellow that has the experience with fracking. Well, I learned about fracking the hard way back in northeastern Pennsylvania. We had a retirement house overlooking Harvey's Lake, the largest natural lake in Pennsylvania. Everything was idyllic until we started seeing signs that said no fracking. We had no idea what no fracking meant. Well, we soon found out when people are fracking near you, you lose 14% of your property value right off the bat. You can't even borrow against your house. Banks will not lend you money. That gives you an idea about the risk analysis that the economic community has with this. All right, we had not to draw it out too much, but this is sort of like the salacious part. We ended up joining this environmental activist group called GDAC, Gas Drilling Awareness Committee, and we were branded as eco-terrorists. And the most radicalized one happened to be the lead. He's a podiatrist. Anyway, it was a whole compilation of educators, government workers, etc. We actually had our phones tapped. People don't believe me when I say that. And we hear about FISA and how people are incensed about that. Well, we actually had our phones tapped. The ex-governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Corbett, got most of his campaign money from oil and gas. We finally got that stopped. But anyway, one of the few ways we found out that we could push back successfully is to conduct baseline water testing. We had 2 water wells baseline water testing on our property. And it cost $1,800 for both wells. There's some other areas affected besides Pennsylvania and California, and this next chart shows Wyoming. It's in Pavilion, Wyoming, where they've had polluted groundwater. North Dakota and the Bakken oil fields, Shell Oil, they've also had their groundwater contaminated. In California, and I'd like you to read this because I think it really speaks volumes to what I'm trying to get across to you in this information exchange. So if you'd read it to yourselves for a second here, and then I'll go over it. Now, we would have never known this. Our local regulators in the state wouldn't have said anything hadn't the federal EPA ordered a review of possible contaminations. And there was a discrepancy on how the state of California characterized drinking and usable water versus the federal EPA. Well, the next step going forward, we're asking for your help and permission to isolate water from United's at the PHWA, the Port Hueneme Water Agency plant for testing. We would like to test for identified analytes and constituents, so we've got a total of 71. After that, assuming that, and we assume that there will be nothing wrong, we'll be submitting the results to the county for water quality records and retaining copies. And then we'll be continuing, even though we have discussions about it's just effective if we do this on a one-time basis. You have it. If something happens in the future, you can take it to court. Your ratepayers will thank you for that. But to be more responsible, it probably should be done on regular intervals, 5-year intervals, we'll say. This next slide will show the candidate analytes. These are chemicals that we'll be testing for. And I probably should have highlighted some, but I'll just very quickly going down to benzene, toluene, ethylene, and that's nothing more than diesel. Diesel has been used in the past in the state of California for fracking. Boron, you'd wonder why boron would be so interesting. Well, it's not a carcinogen or a toxin, but it is a flag. It will indicate where oil and gas activity have happened. You have an increase in boron. boron, you have probably had some contamination occur and you can do further testing. Ethanol, which is nothing more than natural gas. We have hydrochloric and hydrofluoric. As I said, hydrofluoric acid is used more in California for acidizing. We have manganese and iron, and I don't think I have to explain to you that, you know, it's a cosmetic issue, but we thought we would add those to it. We have nitrates for ag. We have sulfuric acid also. So I've handed out a frequently asked questions having to do with baseline water testing. That's for your takeaway. I've been doing all the talking. Thank you. Hopefully we got this under 14 minutes. But I'd love to entertain any questions that you may have at this point.
Thank you, Bob, for that presentation. How frequent would the testing, you're suggesting every 5 years? Is that what you're?
Well, our general manager recommends 5 years. The actual test itself, we've gone out and we've gotten 2 bids. One is good until October, which is around 1,700. So we're not talking a lot of money here, and that's already been allocated by our board. So yeah, it could be one time, it could be every 5 years, but to be able to chart trends, probably you need to do it on an interval basis. The water district for Los Angeles is starting here in 2018, is going to be coming down and characterizing the Oxnard Plain. They think it's also of interest.
In a former life, I used to, I was involved in telecommunication projects, installing fiber optics, and fracking was part of that process of getting the infrastructure through bedrock and the like, so it was all underground. And the drilling muds occasionally would seep to the surface because that's the nature of fracking, is that you're seeking out cracks in the bedrock. A lot of that material is, yes, there are chemicals involved, but not necessarily toxic. Are you looking for specific types of chemicals that, in fact, it's one thing to say the water's contaminated, it's another thing to say it's unhealthy to drink. Are there particular toxins that you're looking for in your testing? Well,
the actual shorter answer is these are the candidate analytes. It's not cut and dry because of the Halliburton loophole, and some of the studies that I went and I looked at, and the one study that I drew from 30% of what went into the ground that was toxic or carcinogenic were proprietary, and there are some that are so new that they don't even have testing protocols for. There's no CASRA numbers for them. So to answer your question, this is the best we can do with the information that we're allowed. And this isn't a good situation to be in. Nobody wants to be in. I can't imagine democracy being subjected to the first thing you do is you protect your water. And if you can't do that, it's pretty damn bad.
Well, one of the reasons I was asking the question is that we have all kinds of chemicals in our water, natural chemicals, and there are thresholds of what's considered healthy and you know, dangerous or potentially toxic. So you have quite a list here, and I assume that there is a certain level of, or a threshold that is allowed for the amount, or
for the
parts
toxic,
per million, sort of.
Yes, yeah, for the toxic and the carcinogenic chemicals, there's maximum contaminate limits, and once that happens, then we would be notifying everybody along the chain.
So who's actually doing the testing? You've
This-
taken the charge on,
These are two independent labs locally, because we don't want to have to pay for any per diem or anything, that have been designated by the state of California as able to do baseline water testing. And that's it.
so the last question I
They're
have.
independent
Oh, I'm sorry.
third-party, I'm sorry. They're independent third-party labs. Our water purveyor, United, yeah, they do some of their own testing. They also go out and they have contracted out labs. This is a third party involved, and the big thing is the strict chain of custody involved that will withstand some pretty high-priced lawyers put in by the oil companies.
So my last question is really more directed to staff of, is this a good thing, bad thing? Does it complicate life for everyone? I guess that's to Mr. Hickox. Is this something that that staff would be endorsing and recommending this board follow suit?
Well, analysis, the more analysis you have, the more knowledge and history you have with the sampling. Many of these items are in the Title 22 requirement for testing. I sent you, okay. Have you cross-referenced the chemicals on this list versus what's in that report that I sent? Because United takes this sampling every year and provides our water agency with its numbers and its analysis. And we include that also in our annual water quality report. So a lot of, many, if not majority of them, are listed in that Title 22 compliance.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Not only does United test for the majority of these, you guys also send this out, I'm guessing in a bill insert once a month, or once a year rather. There are certain chemicals listed up here that, however, are not covered, and those are the ones that, as Director Nass mentioned, would be flags or indicators of potential increased energy exploration near the basin. So, as Mr. Hickok said, yeah, the majority of them are covered. I think what Director Nast is looking for is to have an additional test that would cover everything not already tested for.
And what I would recommend is if you can identify those 20 indicators that are the most critical or most severe that aren't included in the annual sampling, then sample those, target those specific constituents, and it would reduce your sampling protocol.
Yeah, I think maybe not only sampling protocol, but perhaps the invoice as well. So,
Exactly.
the cost as it stands today was surprisingly reasonable, which was good news. So yeah, I think we'll take that suggestion, pare that down to the ones that aren't already being tested for, and then hopefully schedule some time, assuming staff is on board and the will of this board is such that it's agreeable to have this done. We'll coordinate that through Steve and staff and get the testers out here at some point in the future.
And if
Let me add something there. I informally on my own went through and I bumped it against Title 22. We'll get you a specific list of what is not being tested under Title 22. But even if it is, this baseline water testing requires strict chain of custody, which United, they're not qualified to do baseline water testing. So irrespective of, we're talking saving $800 here and losing a court case worth billions. So I think it's kind of a dollar waiting on a dime, personally.
So, to that end, like I said in the outset, these are funds that the Beach District has set aside probably close to 8 or 9 months ago, and allocated for this effort. So, whatever the price tag ends up being, whatever the analytes we do end up testing for, that cost will be borne by the Beach District. So, again, if we do pare that down or not, regardless, the overall amount for testing would be borne by the district. Any
Yeah,
other questions?
so I have a question. Sure. Yes, okay, thank you. So, who else does this kind of testing? I mean, not the lab, but other cities, other water districts, have you seen any?
Well,
Maybe in our area?
yeah, to answer your question, there's a state law, it's called Senate Bill 4, which requires baseline testing if a well is within 1,500 foot of either a public or private well. The wells that we're looking at are outside of that envelope. But as you know, water travels underground, and if the contaminant happens to be water soluble, you got a real issue. United's tracking an MTBE plume. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's an additive for gasoline. It's highly carcinogenic. The state ran out of money to go ahead and mitigate this release. So it's there. It's not moving, but it can move fast. And one of the things is we were asking that MTBE be checked. I'll take a look at 122, Title 22. But that, for your information, we also have a similar situation here on the base, where the base gas station had a leak of underground storage tanks, and MTBE had to be remediated there. Thank goodness that they got it all there. The other release in Satakoy was bigger, and the state ran out of money. So all we've been doing is looking at it, instead of going in and trying to remediate it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that was one question. The other one is, how long does it take for this test to come back? So say we bring it back to consider, it's a done deal by the end of, March or whenever our next meeting is. Does it take several weeks, or is it something that this board will then have access to when you get the information back?
Yeah, and I'll let Bob kind of expand on my response, but most definitely this board would have access to whatever the test results are. From my understanding, they were to come out and test and take water samples back, they would have a report back with the results within a few weeks, was my understanding.
Right, with the exception of some of the more esoteric ones that may not have a testing protocol, and they may not be tested for it. But yeah, so it'll only be a matter of several weeks. For legal purposes, the person that pays for the test owns the data. If we were to do it, we would be sharing it with y'all, with United, etc. But still, we own the data.
And then one last question. So if we get data that, supports maybe your hypothesis here, what are we going to do?
We
What-
don't think.
What are we going to do? Hold on. So when we get this information, what are we going to do with it? I mean, what's really the end game here, and what would you consider?
So I think there's a portion of Bob's presentation that is very key, and that is we're not looking to find an issue, nor are we trying to, we don't expect to find one either. The whole purpose of this exercise is to, as the name implies, create a baseline of where we are at today, with the idea being that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we go back and do the same exercise, if we were to look at those key analytes that are commonly found in areas where there is energy exploration, you could actually make a comparison. If there are, and to address your question more directly, if there are analytes that we think are kind of higher than average, or maybe present a problem straight away, yeah, of course, that's something for this board to consider, whether we want to knock on United's door and say, hey, we think maybe you should test for this at your well now that we've done it at on our side as the user end, and maybe see if you're seeing similar results. It's a conversation starter at the very least.
And certainly, we're not the only agency that takes water from United, correct? So Oxnard does, and it supplies others. So would it relate to a better combined effort with some of those others versus just us exclusively, or is it just for us? Because it is where those wells,
Sure.
It's going out to different areas.
I think when you look at the chain of events that would need to happen, you kind of got to approach it on a step-by-step basis. I mean, there's a very high likelihood that we test for this we see what the results are, and we tuck it away for another day, and we don't talk about it until we go ahead and test again to do the comparison. If there is an issue, I guess the question was, would we then go approach our neighbors to kind of have a unified front towards United? That remains to be seen, and rather than kind of conjecture here and now, I would say let's see what those results are before engaging any of our neighbors. And Steve, do you have any additions to that?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Part of proper sampling protocol is to really, if you're looking for something specific or in a specific region, then you go to that source and you sample at the source. Sampling downstream in our service area for something that may be occurring 15 miles up north could be distorted or not accurately reported in the analysis, where if you took the sample at the point of origin, you're most likely being able to find out which one of the 5 wells that are running is having the biggest problem. Where what we would see is a blend of those 5 wells, and we may see an increase in number, but it may be diluted by adding more good quality water to it. So if you're really trying to find something specific, it really should be at the source. And the analysis that are in the Title 22, there is a legal chain of custody, just for this board's knowledge, that all water systems must follow. There is a sign-in right on the document. There's a place for every time that sample changes hands, there's a signature and a timestamp.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that doing it at the PHWA level is kind of the next best thing. Our first, our preferred alternative was to, of course, have United go ahead and perform the testing, and we actually offered to fund that exercise as well, but for whatever reason they preferred that we didn't. So our next best alternative is to then do it at the PHWA level, which is what we're trying to accomplish today.
Yeah, well, the reason, the written reasons that were given were by their head hydrogeologist, Dan Dittmer, and he says, in conversations with the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, which is the regulator, shows there's only been 7 frac jobs. Well, we dispute that, but even that the way that is, it's a good insurance policy. We're not talking a lot of money here, but I am concerned, and I'll go on the record, is that the optimum solution would be is to test from one of the from one of the wells that access the lower aquifer system and one that accesses the upper aquifer system, and I think that would be more representative and easier to defend. However, you got to be pragmatic about this. I don't know why United doesn't want us to do this testing. I'm a little bit confused, and anyway, you'd have to ask United. We've got in writing why they didn't want to have the testing done. I don't know if it comes under heading, if you can't take a no, don't ask the question. But, I'll leave that up to United.
I'll be willing to contact United if this was the board's direction on behalf of PHWA to see if they would be willing to allow either us or Channel Islands Beach to have access for that sampling. It's something that can be done on any day, any time that the wells are running. It would take about 15 minutes at the most to get the samples. So effort-wise, it's pretty minimal.
Well, I hope that approach would be successful, but I think the background of the story, in case it was missed, is that we've tried on several occasions to try and get United to allow us to do the testing, and the reason that we're here today is because this is the next best thing. And so I agree with you that doing it at the United level would be ideal, and if they allowed that, we would want to go that route. However, it doesn't seem like we've gotten very far. They've gently declined that offer in person, in writing, over the phone, and we've now decided to try and take this up at the PHWA level. So, I think what we're trying to propose today is if we can just test this initially at the PHWA level, let's document it. We'll all share the results. We'll send it to the county for record. And then if there is something that's abnormally high, we can then talk about a strategy on how to knock on United's door. But assuming there are no fatal issues with that report, we'll just tuck it away for a future date. And as Director Nass said, come back in about 5 years and test again to see if there's any notable changes.
No question. Okay, thank you very much.
And I concur that the State Water Board does have concerns regarding fracking and the impacts to the groundwater tables.
The consent, the cash disbursement. I only had one of mine, so I don't know what you have in yours, okay?
Yeah, so, I move on the consent items.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
Madam Chair, so the presentation in part was informational, but I kind of got the impression you're looking for endorsement as well from the board on allowing for this testing to occur. Is that what the intent was, is to make that request? And it may require a separate agenda item for a separate meeting.
Right,
I
this
don't.
is just a presentation.
Yeah, I would pose that question to the attorney in the room. Does a request of this nature require agendizing for a future meeting, or is this something that you consider to be operational that both myself and Mr. Hickox could see through at a later date?
Well, to the extent that you're asking for permission or consent from the board, which is not stated in the agenda, so it could not be done today, you would need a separate agenda item at another meeting. I don't actually have an opinion as to whether or not it's an operational matter. I think that's a practical question. I would say that you're not asking for PHWA to expend any monies, so if Channel Islands was going to undertake the testing at its own expense and it doesn't represent any danger or complication or confusion to the system, then it would seem as like it's an informational item. But if the board today wishes to express some position on it, which would be guidance to staff, then certainly it can do that. Did that answer the question?
I think it
so.
did. So if I understood you correctly, this could be done just by between staff, and it would be a request to the executive director, and barring any strong objection from the board, that we could get permission from the executive director to carry out the test.
Unless the board feels that shouldn't be done and wants to express that, yes. But yeah, I think that's an appropriate thing because, as I said, Mr. Hickox has not expressed any reservations about negative effects of the baseline testing. On a purely legal basis, I think it's always good to anticipate litigation, and to the extent that it's realistic and feasible to do so, having a baseline test in our records, if there should be some kind of contamination from any source which arose in the future, then it could be demonstrated that in fact there had been an impact on our water source. That's always a good place to be. Otherwise, you're arguing about whether or not that condition pre-existed. So, but in the absence of the strenuous or objection from the board, I don't see that you need anything. It was mostly an informational item.
To answer your question?
Yeah, I'd be curious to understand United's reservation for this kind of testing to occur, just because they're a partner in the process here. I certainly don't object to having testing done. It's just more of a concern about one of our partners of what their concerns are.
Sure.
You know,
It's-
and you know, so as a board member, I have no objection to working out an arrangement with staff because it doesn't interfere with the operations. That's fine. Doesn't cost the PHWA anything, but I think it's worth following up with United as to, are we missing something here? You know, is there cause to be concerned about this kind of activity? But I say proceed.
Thank you.
Well, when Mr. Hickox gets a hold of United, and that could be one of the questions you could ask and bring back to us. I think that would be helpful.
I could do that. It would be in April that I could get back. I'll be out of the country next month.
Okay.
But maybe I can get it before I leave.
Okay, thank you. Did this. Right, so we're on our business items, and we need to, we need two directors, one from the city and one as a member at, to serve as a member at large, and one from, CIB CSD to serve as an alternate. Mr. Berg, I believe, right? You're the newest person here. Would you like to try? Was that right? Okay. Is there anybody here? Is there anybody here from Fort Wainimi that would be interested?
Well, I set Mr. Berg up once before on committee appointments, and my uncle, who's one of the board members of United, contacted me and said, you need to step up. And so, you know, what am I going to say? My uncle has asked me to so unless you really want to serve.
I'd actually like to nominate
Okay.
to serve on this committee.
And maybe your
And
uncle can give us
you
our
know,
answers
I
quicker.
wouldn't mind if you did that either. You know?
Okay,
it's
okay.
fine.
Well, you'll make my uncle happy.
All right.
Okay, so we have a nomination.
If I may.
Yes.
This
may.
item is being brought back because there was a question on, at the one previous meeting, when are the meetings held for this, appointment?
One
And
second.
they're held, if you look at the calendar of
Yes.
events, it's the, it's listed under board meeting.
Yes.
Looks like it's every other month, 6 times a year, every other month.
Yes,
And I believe it's on a Thursday
the 15th,
at 3 p.m.
yes. Is that okay with you, sir?
Yes, thank you.
You're more than welcome. Can you vote on him?
We can.
We can just accept him. We accept you. So,
Thank you.
we tried to get Mr. Berg, but now,
Acclamation.
oh, absolutely.
Or without objection.
Without objection.
That objection.
Bob, would you like to be the alternate? So we have two without,
Welcome aboard.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to be the alternate.
oh, perfect.
There you
Okay.
Do you have an uncle that,
That twisted your arm.
Okay. All right. Going to 5B, Mr. Hicks.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board. Before we move forward with this item, I'd like to call out 2 corrections. On page 11 of 24, under next PHWA board meeting, that should actually be March 19th, not March 20th. And then the following pages, 12 through 22 of 24, the only page that is a part of this report is page 17 of 24. The rest of the pages were inadvertently added to the report and they have no reference to the topic of this report. The other pages, and they're too small. We would have never prevented.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yes, it was in error, and there should be a correction page, that's available for, everyone to use.
The correction page takes care of the areas that, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Page
The-
12 through
The
24.
pound signs that happen when you don't have enough room, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Poured over all these charts.
Yes.
And I'm going like, that looks the same and that looks the same, it's like, what? I can't read that.
I know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. It's all right.
Oh,
All right, with those, corrections made, does that have to be, approved or anything?
No.
Mr. Attorney? Okay. All right, moving forward, on this report is the, blending options that were discussed previously in other board meetings. It was, brought to, the board a couple of times, and different blending ratios were provided. This is, from what I understand now, that is what, the board was looking for. This is, option 2 is in between option 1 and option 3. And that provides the agency with the ability to stay in track with our budget and provide the best water quality within our budget. And options 1, 2, and 3 are with membrane bypass mode. That means we're not using or in production with the membranes. And as a reminder, we are currently running the membranes, so now we are in membrane production, and option 4 is more appropriate to what it's gonna look like by the end of the fiscal year with operating the membranes. We should still be under about $180,000 just in water purchases. And if water quality diminishes and we're no longer able to take that into the plant, then option 2 would be the fallback. Is that my understanding? Okay. So, I guess one of the recommendations is that the board would then, if this is the correct information that I've finally given you, that the board would then give direction as part of this report later on. Okay. Any further questions on the blending?
yeah, I do
Yes.
have a question. Thank you, Mr. Hickox, for putting this together, because this is exactly what we're looking at. So, option 4, it still has us running under budget, and that would be over the projected year, right? So at the end of the year, we'd be under 180?
Approximately, yes.
And then, explain again what TDS is, because I know you'd talked about it originally.
TDS is total dissolved solids. For the most part, that's what customers relate to. TDS is a measurement of the mineral content within the water. If you notice, option 1 has a TDS of 1100, and with the membranes in option 4, the TDS is 375. So you can see that the membranes effectively remove about 70% of the mineral content of the water. This will help avoid water spots and calcium buildup on the fixtures and valves. It'll be a little more pleasant with laundering clothing, washing hair. Suds and soap will last a little longer. So really the water quality is best when run through the membranes.
And I know we had talked about how there's a standard or a range, and what was the high end? Was it 1,300?
Well, that's for the MCL. The MCL is actually 1,000.
1,000.
The maximum contaminant level. However, this is a secondary standard. A secondary standard is considered aesthetic. There is no real health effect of high TDS water. However, when you're over 1,000, the state tries to get the water purveyors to do something about it, just to make it so that it's not so rough and coarse, and, cause it can be damaging to the plumbing fixtures and pipelines.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Moving forward with the operational report, our production averaged around 2.8 million gallons per day. The percentage of use, 87% was United, 13% Cayugas for this reporting period, with an average silt density index of 0.7. Again, the 0.7 is favorable. Anything below 3.0 is permissible to run through the membranes. And that 0.7 average is being accomplished by, again, the operational manipulation of United on the wellheads up in the El Rio well field. So that process is still being beneficial to us. Excuse me. The water supply shortage, there is none identified at this time. The Sigma and GSP plan that's coming in the future could change that, and we'll know how much and how bad that will be once more data is submitted into the GSP. The next board meeting was covered March 19th. However, I will be on vacation until the 22nd. So a decision could be made here today if the board desires to have just read and file reports that I can generate before I leave. And if you have questions, I could answer them upon my return, or if possible, there was an option that maybe Mr. Akbar, Alakon would be willing to present the reports. So I guess I'll leave that decision up to the board.
What is it, would you rather not have it?
Not have, well, I
Not
think
have a
that,
meeting, or because he's not here, or to have, do it?
I could provide the reports,
You could.
and they would just be receive and file. And I doubt that there will be much action taken by the board unless there's failure in the operation process, which would require a whole different report. I don't see the GSP moving any faster than it has been, so there's probably no action needed to be taken in the FCGMA update. And with those two reports, that's pretty much going to be the operation for the next month.
Is that all right with you, Mr. Alcon?
Yeah, we discussed this at our operations meeting earlier this month, and the options are precisely that. If we do still want to hold a meeting, I am happy and hopefully capable to fill in Steve's stead. So it's purely the will of the board. If you'd like to hold a meeting, I'm happy to do it, and if not, you can feel free to cancel.
No?
I would say we just opt not to have a meeting next month and come back in April.
And I can include the operational performance of March in the month of April's
Yeah.
report.
Okay, I was just wondering, you went through the procedure that we did, where you mark things down. Oh, and your
Oh,
council
the
meeting.
strategic planning.
When are you planning to get the results back, do you know?
Yeah, so the council had a follow-up workshop last Tuesday, the 13th, where the results were presented.
Yes.
So yeah, so we're that far along, and the next steps, the council directed the consultant to compile all of those responses, and we'll have a follow-up document prepared that kind of summarizes everything and moves us toward our next step, and actually turning all of that into a strategic plan.
Well, at what point do we compare both of ours?
We can talk about it when you get to number 6.
I could.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. So,
Okay.
so with this issue, I guess it would be where, I would recommend that we not meet, this board not meet, for March timeframe, and then we'll just catch up with you in April.
Okay.
And then it looks like we have 2 motions to make here, one to receive and file, and the other to direct staff. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So, I move that, the board receive and file the operational report.
Second.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
All right, and
got
then
it.
for the blending ratio option,
Yes.
that, the board direct staff on, that we would, do option 4 as we are with membrane treatment right now. And, if we're not using the membrane, we do option 2.
All those in favor?
You need a second. So that was my motion.
I'll second then.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Goodness, I'm not used to it. Okay, board member reports and comments.
5C.
Oh,
That's right.
sorry, Fox Canyon.
That's okay.
Yes,
Oh.
Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency update, sir.
Yes, thank you. Again, this report, it'll be similar as last month. The GSP, the preliminary draft has been sent out. The 90-day comment period is still open until April 3rd. Really, the only thing that's changed since the last month is that both PHWA and the Navy submitted documents to the consultant of the GSP. We submitted the urban water management plan for both the city and Port Hueneme Water Agency to be included as reference in the document. And the Navy sent in a land use study. I don't know the title of it, but it's land use study for military function and local community involvement. So there's a combined use there. So those documents have been submitted for the consultant to include. The GSP, the preliminary draft, is still full of holes and data gaps. The primary items that are missing is the safe yield of the groundwater aquifer, the ramp down period, whether it be a short, steep ramp down period or a long-term, slowly graduating down ramp down period. So those still need to be identified. They also require flexibility to be put into the plan for whenever they do come up with an allocation program. It won't be so hardened or strict. It will allow for movement up and down similar to the water year. If we get a wet year and more water becomes available, they might loosen the reins a little bit. If we don't get more water and we continue down this drought, they'll tighten it up a little bit. So they're trying to find a way that meets the requirement of the GSP and yet still provides flexibility to the pumpers. So they're really trying to find a way to make it all work, and I can assure you this is not an easy subject. We're meeting again tomorrow, and the players in core groups have been changing. The opinions of the ag community versus the M&I are, we're still in communication, they're in sync, but we're not really on the same page because we have different needs. So, but we're still moving forward. We meet monthly with the GMA staff, our 2 core groups. We have 3 individuals in our core group on the M&I, and the ag community has 3 core individuals. And together they sit down with the GMA board and have really a lot better productive meetings. You get the full group in there, you got over 50, 60 people, and it's too difficult to really coordinate. So, but we're making progress. It's slow, and it's not going to be it's not going to be easy for everybody. So that's, if I can take anything away from that GSP, it's some people are gonna be okay and some people aren't.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I move that we receive and file this report.
So if that's your motion, I'll do
Yes.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Board member reports and comments. I take it first. I want to know what's happening, approximately where we are with that process that you're going through, that we can kind of think of when we're going to get together with both of their products.
Both of the findings, right?
Yes.
So, just reporting here that the city of Port Hueneme actually had our second our second planning session with the consultants, and we found that there were some commonalities. I think out of like 5 or 6 options, you know, we really felt good about several of them. But we are at the end of that consulting time frame as well as the funding. I think there was still just a little bit left there. And so the council directed staff to then continue to work on maybe solidifying some of the items that we can move forward on. I think there was one that demonstrated maybe it's just more of a pie in the sky kind of effort, but it's something that could be there. And what I came out of that discussion or that meeting sensing is that we still have options to create water as well as to work with other organizations within our region in order to do so. I mean, there was one creative way where we would run a tertiary treatment, and then maybe with that water we create water and maybe sell it to Oxnard or do something with it. So there were really very wonderful options for us. And I believe that's where we stand is with all of that, right? I don't know if we have anything like a date certain, but you know, certainly those were some really great discussions.
I just remember that you people from Port Hueneme works, you were going back and forth whether you want to go through this process, and I thought it was a wonderful process, and I wonder at this point, are you glad you did?
I am. So
thought
we can ask my other colleagues here, but I'm really glad we went through that process.
What I think at the end of the day was that we found a lot of common ground with the Channel Islands Beach Services District. So as we move forward, and the intent is that we complete our effort, but then to compare notes with the district. But it was very encouraging to hear that we're largely on the same page.
It is.
So, and I don't know, Mr. Butler, if there's been any scheduling made or arrangements to, to have that kind of joint discussion with our.
Yeah, we haven't gotten into specific dates yet. I think the consultant was directed to come back with a scope of work for kind of the next steps, and we can make sure that part of that is I don't know if it would be a joint meeting of the council and the
board,
CSD board. Right. Maybe that would be the best way to do it, but that there somehow be a process where the two bodies can compare notes on what came out of each planning process.
And they're also supposed to come back and give the city a final report
Yes.
in writing on the conclusions of the program. And then, as Rod said, they'll be presenting scope of work and proposal for a PHWA group strategic planning session.
Right. I think that'd be good.
Just take it the next step up.
Right.
So I
Good.
guess the takeaway, if you'd like to report back to your board, is that we are, I think, beginning to coalesce in a common way our respective goals, and we were encouraged by that. And we weren't, that wasn't the exercise wasn't slanted in that direction. It was totally independent, but the outcome appears very favorable to a joint effort of the two bodies. So
I think it's positive for
Yeah.
everyone. Okay. Mr. Nass?
reports.
Do you have any comments? Okay. Nope. You mean they didn't hoodwink you as a new member into some interesting committees? They're not doing.
Would you like some?
They're not doing their job right.
This is the one committee that I most wanted to serve.
Touched.
I do have a report, or just a piece of information. My uncle from United. United did an interesting study, and I think it was generally broadcast to this body and a lot of other folks. The economic impact of diverting water away from aquifer recharge for the benefit of environmental purposes. Pretty interesting study, and it might be worthwhile whenever we end up meeting again to support United in the continued effort, beating on whoever, the state and federal representatives, to nail, that issue home that for the relative meager environmental benefits, the return on investment and the loss of water available to us and recharging our aquifers it's a lost cause. And what I'd like to suggest, and I'll be glad to help craft it, is a resolution to support United in that effort to say, listen, people first, trout second. That's kind of boiling it down to maybe a.
You said it all.
No,
But
I would support that.
yeah,
If that's your, I would support bringing it
and
back.
it's an impressive study if you haven't seen it. It's not a long-winded study, but it talks about what the actual costs are to this county for having to invest in these incredible measures, and more importantly, the diversion of water that could otherwise be used for ag and urban
Yes.
consumption. So I thought I'd pass that on to you. Did we settle on a date when we're going to be meeting again?
April, let's see.
Be April 16th.
16th, okay.
April 16th. Got it.
So by then, certainly we'll have something, if that's the pleasure of this board, if that sounds.
Is it a long study, or is it a study
No,
that we
I'll
can
be
put in our
glad to.
packet?
No, I'll be glad to rebroadcast it. I thought it was quite a lengthy list of persons that were included on the distribution. But I'll be glad to resend it to everybody here.
Very good, thank you.
Endangered Species Act is, seems difficult for the boards when it comes to stealing trout. So yeah, I can't speak for the whole group. I think we would be interested in co-signing.
Great. Great.
Sounds good. Okay.
That's it.
That's it? Any new business to be well, are we gonna put the,
That letter of support.
right,
Okay.
new business to be agenda-sized? Agenda-sized. Yeah. Yes. Anybody?
Just,
Okay.
you're saying April 16th, you don't think that we'll be in a position to have any kind of joint discussion with our,
It could, yeah.
It's
almost-
possible?
That's almost
Okay.
2 months off.
all right, but
Well,
that
good
would be a
shit.
special meeting and,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
We don't want to, now that he's got his name in lights, finally, he's getting his recognition, number 7. We don't want to forget.
Oh.
No,
Yeah.
no, new business. Mr. New Business.
Do you have any committee assignments for Mr. Burke?
He has so
I'm
many.
waiting for my uncle to give me those as well. I'll make it brief. Number one, with regards to the GSP, just piggybacking on Mr. Hickok's comments, I do want to emphasize to this board, not to overstate our role in that group, but for being one of the smaller agencies at the table, I feel that Steve and I do our fair share of heavy lifting in terms of trying to push that agenda forward. And so you can rest assured knowing that your two executives are trying their best to get the group and move the football up the field. Just to provide a little bit more clarification on what we're doing tomorrow, our goal right now is to try and figure out where we agree in terms of the M&I folks on each of the points that are eventually trying to make their way into the groundwater sustainability plan. And so if we can identify all the areas of agreement and coalesce around things that sometimes require compromise, we can then use our unified voice as a megaphone to try and get that language into the final GSP, hopefully. That's the goal. And Stephen has been with us with the last meeting as well, and so he's kind of seen firsthand how the sausage is made at the local level. And it's how would you say, how did it go last time? It's kind of slow, right? And then that's the nature of it. It's slow. It's 5 hours of going point by point, but we're going to do it again tomorrow and see how it goes. With regards to the study done by KEH, last I spoke to them, first off, they said they had a pretty good, successful exercise here, and so that was a good review. In terms of where this goes next, the idea is that we would execute an agreement at the PHWA level, and I think that was probably discussed with you, Steve.
Yes, that's the part of the discussion is gonna be tomorrow.
Okay. And if it happens to go that route, which is, I think, in my opinion, the most logical next step, then I suppose that this board would consider that in either April or May or whenever that comes up. And if I'm not mistaken, one of their deliverables on your current agreement with the city is to actually provide those results. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And the last thing is we are testing out, just for the Port Hueneme friends information, we are testing out some new meters at the Beach District, and 2 of our 5 board members have had the pleasure of having these installed in their homes and trying them out for a few weeks. So if you want to get a first-hand review of how those are going, you can ask either one of them, but I know Director Nast has already had some first-hand experience with having a
I fully endorse it. I didn't realize we had a leak, leaky toilet, or the plumber out after we installed the new meters, which it just, without reservation, endorse going to an automatic reading system. We can get rid of the touch labor that's involved now with the manual reading, and reassign those folks to do more meaningful labor. And life cycle cost standpoint, it seems like the best way to go. Anyway, fix the leak in the toilet.
That's
So,
the best news, right?
you have a happy camper over there. So that's all to say that as the city goes ahead and evaluates different options to them, and I'm sure you all have done the math, and when you get ready to do your next change out of cycle, because these things are cyclical, we can kind of be your guinea pig. We've gone and started that test, and suffice it to say that we sprinkled these throughout the service area of our small service area, and it's been 4 weeks in the ground now, and they're reporting accurately and readily and consistently. So to that end, we hope that this is going to be eventually the route that we go. The meters that we chose to install communicate through AT&T towers via cellular network, and they've shown to be working well so far. So when the city gets ready to embark on another meter change out, when you need I guess an example next door of maybe how our experience has gone, we'll have some experience under our belt. So just wanted to put that out there. That's it from me.
Thank you. Whoops.
Before you go, and maybe I should ask this in regard to the earlier report, but the 60-40 split between M&I and Ag, did that take into account historical types of crops? Because, and I ask this, the first watershed was the Los Pozos Basin, I believe, and there was discussion about the fact that certain types of agricultural products, in this case, I think it was a citrus versus strawberries.
Sure.
And of course, they have different consumption requirements or water usage requirements, and that was figured into determining the split in that particular water basin. Did that come into play at all in achieving an outcome here for the 60-40 split?
Yes.
Because we have a lot of cash crops that require a lot of water
Sure.
in this basin in our area. And so I'm wondering if that kind of figured into this distribution.
Well, I'll give you my short answer. I'm sure Steve will have a little bit more to expand on, and that is, I think that is only half the equation. The other half of it is that land uses have changed entirely in some respect, where maybe you're not changing from one crop to another, but you're changing a land use designation altogether from what used to be farmland to now developed homes. And so not only, there's 2 things you have to consider. Number 1 is the scenario that you brought up, which is changing a crop type, and number 2 is the change of land use. And so what we've been told so far, in my experience of 7 months of being part of the group, and Steve, you can correct me, is that both of these factors have been weighed into the negotiations, if you will, to arrive at that 60/40. That's how I see it, and Steve, care to expand on that?
Right, but the 60/40 is largely levied on historical pumping, irregardless of the crop. But that flexibility that I spoke of that they're trying to implement allows for those crop changes. Different times of years, they can, some property owners lease their property for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And during that period of time, they may have the same type of crop and they're a consistent use. But some of those property owners change their crop based on what's making them the most money for the acreage that they have. So, it's seasonal, it changes, it's based on revenue. So there's a number of factors that go into it, and it can't just be one side or the other. You really have to have a base to start from and then build some type of flexibility for both the wet and dry years and the change of crops. And that's what the ag concern has always been.
Yeah.
Where we don't really have an ability to change our population. Our population continues to grow. And so that's why the M&I users are required to come up with plans, conservation plans, or more water projects to allow for the population to continue growing.
Excuse me. And I think both camps are okay with the idea of flexibility, or allowing a mechanism for flexibility. Obviously, it's more of an important concept for the ag community, but even on the M&I side, we're trying to figure out, well, how much flexibility should we advocate for? Are we talking about a 1 year to 1 year flexibility plan, or could you theoretically be in deficit from 5 years ago and use those credits to now apply them today? So those are kind of when we talk about the 5 hour long meetings, these are the kind of details we're trying to iron out.
Thank you.
It's clear as mud.
Clear as blood.
Okay. Okay, new business. What was it? I thought we had 2 things. Oh no, that's right. You were gonna, I thought you were gonna put it on the agenda, was it, back from, United. You were gonna check things with United?
Whether or not they would allow us to
Uh-huh.
sample, I can put that on the agenda.
Well,
Or-
if you have to vote or something, it should be,
I think if they're gonna let us take the sample, we'll just coordinate that with them and let the sample be taken. And if
Okay.
they're not, then I can report back as to why.
and the reasons why they didn't want to begin with, yes. Thank you.
I'll make a formal request. Yeah, and I have a working relationship with, the executives down there. I can speak with the general manager and the assistant general manager and see if there's a possibility of accommodating us. So answer, yes, I could put that on the agenda if they don't let us sample.
Yes, it would be interesting to go over. Okay, and the open forum? Anybody? No? Okay. At that point, it's 5:38. Business adjourned.